For the longest time, we thought dementia is something you deal with when your memory starts to change. But by that point, that process has already been building for years, if not decades. The real opportunity to intervene is much earlier. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to drastically lower your risk of dementia, in some cases by half, even if you are high risk or if you have bad genetics. So I had a patient in my longevity clinic, and he had watched multiple of his family members develop early onset dementia. His grandparents and parents, but he's doing well right now. He's busy, high performing, but he did not want to wait until something showed up. He wanted to know, is there anything we could do now to prevent dementia in the future? And the good news is, yes, there are quite a few things we can do now, and I'm actually more hopeful about this than I was even just 5 or 10 years ago. So one thing we always check in situations like this to better understand our risk profile is the ApoE genotype. And unfortunately, my patient's results showed a 12-fold increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. But the important part is that a result like this does not tell you what will happen, it just tells you where the brain may be more vulnerable. And how aggressively we need to approach this. ApoE helps the brain handle fats and clear waste, and it helps regulate inflammation. And over time, problems in those systems can make the brain more susceptible to damage from our environment. But once again, susceptibility is not destiny. It just means that the brain is more sensitive to the signal it receives, and your brain is receiving signals every single day. Signals from food and from movement, from the environment. Your body's always listening. And the question is, what signals do we want to send it? And this is why I'm so hopeful when it comes to dementia prevention. There was a major report published in The Lancet that showed that up to 45% of dementia cases could be prevented by addressing specific key factors. And when multiple factors are addressed together, some analyses show a risk reduction of over 50%. So even as someone with a high genetic risk, the trajectory is not fixed. We just have to change the inputs. Now, to do that, it really helps to think in terms of systems and not just habits. And there are a few core systems inside the brain that basically determine whether it becomes more resilient or more vulnerable over time. And each one of those systems responds to very specific signals. And by the way, if you're new here, I'm Dr. Leonid Kim, and on this channel, my mission is to give you the science and the practical tools to live longer and feel better. And even though I'm a physician, I'm not your physician. So please talk to your doctor before making any changes to your health regimen, as this video is educational only and not medical advice. So the first system is the brain's cleaning system. There's a pathway called the glymphatic system. You can think of it like a rinse cycle that runs during your sleep, and it clears metabolic waste, protein like beta amyloid, which is important because beta amyloid is one of the proteins linked to Alzheimer's disease. So if the brain does not clear waste well over time, that creates a more vulnerable environment. And this system depends heavily on sleep quality. So not just how long you sleep, but how deep and uninterrupted is your sleep. When your sleep is fragmented, like if you wake up multiple times at night, well, then your brain may not be able to clear all the waste effectively. And over time, that waste starts to build up. And the data behind this is pretty strong. So there was a large meta-analysis that pulled 43 cohort studies that covered over 277,000 people. And they looked at which individual factors carried the strongest association with dementia risk. And sleep disturbances came out on top. People with significant sleep disruption had a 57% higher risk of all-cause dementia compared to people without sleep problems. So the risk was higher than physical inactivity and higher than high blood pressure, and sleep was the single strongest individual factor in the entire analysis. And the key word here is quality, not just quantity. 7 hours of fragmented sleep is not the same thing as 7 hours of deep and consolidated sleep. The deepest stages of sleep, called the slow wave sleep, are when the glymphatic system is the most active. And unfortunately, these are the stages that are most easily disrupted. So what does this look like in practical terms? Well, first, if you snore heavily or someone's told you that you stop breathing during sleep, talk to your doctor about being evaluated for sleep apnea. It's very common and it's very treatable. So for my patient, the one with the high risk genetics, This was one of the first things we had to rule out. Now, beyond that, we really hone in on consistent sleep and wake times. Your lymphatic system runs on a circadian rhythm, so irregular timing disrupts it even when your total hours of sleep look fine. And ideally, we're going to bed at the same time each night, preferably in a cool and a dark room. And one framework I find really useful here is the 3-2-1 rule. So we want to stop eating at least 3 hours before bed. Your digestive system and your brain are competing for resources when you eat late, and it definitely fragments your sleep quality. And then 2 hours before bed, no more liquids, which will help reduce waking up to use the bathroom at night. And then 1 hour before bed, this is where we say no more blue light. So no phones, no computer screens, no TV. Blue light suppresses the release of melatonin, which is the hormone that signals your brain that it's time to shift into sleep mode. And alcohol deserves its own mention here. Alcohol directly impairs that important lymphatic clearance. And alcohol is also a diuretic, so it increases your nighttime awakenings to use the bathroom. So even if alcohol helps you fall asleep faster, the overall effect on brain recovery is still negative. Now, the second system is also incredibly powerful. It involves a special growth signal in the brain called BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So BDNF is a protein, and this protein has many important jobs. It promotes the survival of existing neurons, and it strengthens the connection between them, and it also drives neurogenesis, which is the actual creation of new brain cells. Specifically in the part of the brain called the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is one of the most important memory centers in the brain. It helps form and organize new memories. And unfortunately, it's also one of the first areas damaged in Alzheimer's disease. But the beautiful part about the hippocampus is it is one of the very few parts of the adult brain where new neurons can still grow throughout the life. And one of the most potent mechanisms to release BDNF and actually improve your brain is aerobic exercise. And we now have multiple studies to support this. So there was a randomized control trial that showed that just 1 year of moderate intensity aerobic exercise can increase your hippocampal volume by 2%, which effectively reverses 1 to 2 years of age-related decline. And exercise is doing a lot more than just increasing BDNF. It also increases blood flow to the brain, which means more oxygen and more nutrients delivered with every heartbeat. And then aerobic exercise also reduces systemic inflammation, which, as we now know, plays a direct role in neurodegeneration and the development of dementia. And then we always talk about this, but exercise also improves insulin sensitivity in the brain itself, which actually connects us to the next system I'm going to talk about. And the good news is this doesn't really have to be intense or strenuous aerobic exercise. I mean, intensity of course helps down the road, but even moderate movement has huge effects. There's a meta-analysis of 15 prospective studies that showed that any physical activity was associated with a 38% lower risk of cognitive decline. And it also doesn't take much exercise. The biggest gains come from going from sedentary to moderate movement. Not moderate to extreme. There was a study published in JAMA Neurology, and they put some really useful numbers on this. So the peak benefit zone came in around 9,800 steps per day, which was associated with about a 50% reduction in dementia risk. But the minimum effective dose came in much lower at around 3,800 steps per day, which still lower risk by about 25%. So you can get halfway there with just a 30-minute walk. And what I like to emphasize to a lot of my patients is you really don't have to run a marathon or do these intense sprints for an hour. It's actually just get off the sedentary baseline. That gap between doing nothing and doing something moderate is where you see the most benefit. Now, the third system is the one that I spend the most time on in my clinic. It's your vascular system, specifically your blood vessels that go from your heart to your brain. Your brain is a very blood-hungry organ. It uses about 20% of the blood your heart pumps every single beat, even though it makes up only 2% of your body's weight. So when blood vessels start to degrade, and this can be from years of elevated high blood pressure or from chronically high blood sugar, from inflammation, the brain slowly stops getting what it needs. Now, for most people, this is a very slow and insidious process, but if it goes unchecked for too long, it becomes very hard to, almost impossible to reverse. And blood pressure is especially important here. Chronic high blood pressure damages the small blood vessels that help maintain something called white matter. And white matter is essential to your brain's internal wiring. It's essentially a network of nerve fibers that allows different regions of the brain to talk to each other. But if our blood vessels break down or they're in poor health, well, all of that makes white matter lesions accumulate and over time communication between brain regions gets slower and less reliable. That is one way vascular damage can show up as cognitive decline and lead to a special type of dementia called vascular dementia. Now, this is very important. Midlife hypertension, so elevated blood pressure in your 40s and 50s, seems to carry a greater dementia risk than elevated blood pressure later in life, which makes sense because the damage at this point is accumulating over the span of 20 or 30 or 40 years before anything shows up on a cognitive test. And the same logic applies to blood sugar. Chronically elevated blood glucose, things like insulin resistance and prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, damages those same blood vessels and drives neuroinflammation or inflammation inside the brain. So back to my patient, the one with the really high genetic risk, one of the highest priorities for us was to attack those vascular numbers. And not because anything was terrible, but because in a brain that is already more sensitive to these signals, the vascular environment matters even more. It deserves a more aggressive management. So we really dialed in on those early markers of insulin resistance and inflammation and early markers of heart disease. Because protecting our blood vessels is one of the most powerful ways to protect the brain. And by the way, I go a lot more in depth on what those blood markers and labs are, and I'm going to post a link to those in the description below. Now, the fourth system, this is the one that sometimes gets dismissed because it sounds the softest, but I want to make the case that it isn't. There's a concept in neuroscience called cognitive reserve. And the idea is that throughout your life, through mentally demanding work and learning new skills and doing hard and unfamiliar things, you build a kind of a structural surplus or a backup system in the brain. More synaptic connections and more alternative pathways. Basically, more ways for the brain to reroute signals when something gets damaged. And this is so important, especially as we age. There are people, and this has been documented, with fully confirmed Alzheimer's pathology in the brain on brain scans. So amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, the whole picture, but they were still cognitively intact and they were functioning very well in their daily life. And why is that? Well, because their brains had built enough reserve to compensate for the damage. And that reserve is built over a lifetime or not built, really depending on how the lifetime was spent. So you build this reserve by consistently challenging the brain, learning a new skill, entering a new domain. That kind of challenge drives adaptation in the brain because the brain, just like your muscles, responds to demand. If you're repeatedly given new problems to solve, it will build new connections to meet that demand. And if you're looking for one activity that seems to combine a lot of these benefits together, one thing I often recommend is racket sports. So this would be things like tennis or pickleball or badminton or table tennis. There was a large prospective study out of Copenhagen. They followed over 8,500 people for up to 25 years and they compare life expectancy gains across different sports. And tennis came out on top. It was associated with almost 10 additional years of life expectancy compared to sedentary individuals. And badminton was second at 6.2 additional years, both ahead of jogging and swimming and cycling. And one reason for that could be that racket sports combine multiple brain demands at the same time. So you get physical exertion and rapid decision making. You're also getting hand-eye coordination and a lot of spatial processing. And probably the most underrated of all, you get social connection. Because you would need to play those sports with someone else. In fact, having a team element in a sport was independently associated with better cognition in both midlife and later life, even after adjusting for total physical activity volume. So it wasn't just the exercise doing all the work. There's something about the psychosocial contact of team sports that matters beyond the exercise itself. And another important finding from the same research group was that low physical activity was associated with about a 60% increased risk of non-Alzheimer's dementia. And this was regardless of the ApoE genotype. So even in people with high genetic risk, like my patient, physical activity was still incredibly protective. Genetics certainly matter and we have to account for those, but they're not the final decision maker. I hope this is helpful. Stay healthy and I'll see you in the next one.